Clayton Reeves had learned early in life that hope was just a thing people held onto before the world beat out of them. He wasn't a cruel man, just tired. The land he worked had been in his family for 2 generations, but lately it felt like he was only burying it deeper under debt and drought. The grass was yellow, the cattle were thin, and the roof of the barn rattled like old bones every time the wind picked up. He told himself he was holding on for his late wife, for the memory of the life they almost had. But the truth was darker. Clayton didn't just stay out of loyalty. He stayed because he didn't know how to walk away. The people in town pitted him in that quiet, uncomfortable way small towns do. They nodded at him when he passed, offered tight-lipped smiles, never asked too much. Everyone knew about the fire that took his wife and unborn child. What they didn't know was that she'd been leaving him that night. The fire had covered a lot of sins. Clayton never corrected the story. On the edge of town, just behind the train depot and the general store, stood the warehouse. Folks didn't talk much about what went on in there. Officially, it was a boarding house for working children, orphans who needed shelter and food in return for labor. Unofficially, it was where men went when they needed cheap hands who wouldn't ask questions. The kids came and went. No one knew their names. Clayton didn't go there out of kindness. He went there because he needed help. Real help. He tried hiring local men, but nobody wanted to work for a rancher who might not make it through winter. So he went to the warehouse with a name already in mind. A girl he'd seen stacking crates outside the depot a few weeks back. Thin as a rail, maybe 12 or 13, but fast. Quiet. The man who ran the place, Mr. Grady, had yellow teeth and a way of talking that made your skin itch. "You want hope," he said when Clayton pointed the girl out. Strong back, keeps her mouth shut. Don't ask where she's from. Don't ask about her people. She's yours for $30. Clayton didn't ask. He handed over the money, signed the papers, and brought the girl home. Hope didn't say much. She kept her eyes down and followed orders, but there was something in the way she moved, cautious, like a stray dog waiting for the boot. The first night, Clayton gave her a blanket and a corner of the barn to sleep in. The girl didn't thank him. She just nodded once and sat down on the hay like it was more than she'd hoped for. At first, Clayton told himself it was just business. He needed help, and the girl needed a place to be. But then days turned into weeks. Hope worked hard, harder than any grown man Clayton had ever hired. She never complained, never asked for anything more than a crust of bread and water. Still, there was something off about it. The silence, the way the girl flinched when a door slammed, the way she never turned her back on Clayton. One morning, Clayton found Hope in the chicken coop before dawn, her hands shaking as she tried to feed the birds. The sun hadn't even come up yet. "You don't need to start this early," Clayton said. Hope didn't answer. Her eyes were bloodshot, lips chapped, just nodded and kept feeding. That night, Clayton couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall, wondering what kind of life made a child act like that. He thought about asking, but something stopped him. Maybe because deep down, he didn't want to know. Because if he knew, he'd have to care. And caring led to hurt. One afternoon, when they were fixing the fence line, Hope dropped a rail and winced. "What is it?" Clayton asked. The girl hesitated, then pulled up her sleeve. Her arm was bruised and scarred. Old marks, fresh ones. Whip scars. Clayton stared at them, heart sinking into his boots. "Grady did that." Hope nodded once, eyes still fixed on the ground. Clayton felt something burn in his chest. He hadn't asked, hadn't wanted to know, but now he did, and knowing changed things. He didn't sleep that night either. The next morning, he hitched his horse and rode into town, jaw clenched. He went straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Eddings was a tired man with a lazy eye and a drawer full of ignored complaints. "You got proof?" he asked when Clayton told him about the girl. "I got the girl's back." "That enough?" Eddings sighed, leaned back in his chair. "You really want to stir this up, Reeves? Grady's got friends. Some of them important. I didn't ask about his friends. Don't say I didn't warn you." Back at the ranch, Hope was cleaning tack in a barn. When Clayton told her he'd gone to the law, the girl froze, then shook her head. "They won't help," she whispered. They never do. Clayton didn't know what to say to that. He just nodded and sat down beside her. But word spread fast in a town like theirs. That night, someone threw a rock through Clayton's window. The next morning, 2 fence posts were cut clean through. Then the threats came, words scrawled on the barn door, whispers at the feed store. People stopped nodding, stopped smiling. Hope saw it too. She tried to run one night, but Clayton caught her just past the cattle gate. Where would you go? Anywhere but here. Clayton knelt in front of her, voice low. I'm not letting you go back to that. Not while I'm still breathing. Hope looked at him for a long time. Why do you care? Clayton didn't have an answer he could explain. Only that he saw pieces of himself in the girl. The silence, the shame, the scars that didn't show. Maybe he cared because no one had cared for him when it mattered most. Maybe he was trying to fix something in himself through the kid. Or maybe, for once, he was just doing the right thing. But the town wasn't done yet. One morning, Hope was gone. Vanished. The barn door was open, the rope she'd been using to hold up the saddle hooks cut clean. There was blood on the hay. Clayton didn't wait. He saddled up and rode straight to the warehouse. The doors were locked. He kicked them open. Inside, the children were gone. All of them. The cots empty, the crates moved, the walls bare. Grady was nowhere in sight. But in the back room, he found a trail of blood. And Hope's shoe. What Clayton didn't know yet, what would come out later, was that Grady hadn't worked alone. The whole operation was deeper than anyone guessed, tied into a network that stretched across counties. And Hope wasn't just some orphan. She was the daughter of a woman who tried to expose it all and vanished not long after. That secret, and the way it unraveled, would crack the town's silence wide open. But for now, all Clayton knew was that someone had taken the girl, and he wasn't going to let them keep her. Clayton spent the next few days moving like a man half asleep, driven more by instinct than thought. He asked questions at the depot, at the boarding houses, even at the saloon, though he hated the place. Most people gave him blank stares or stiff answers. A few looked scared to say anything at all. Word had spread, Grady was gone, and the children with him. What no one would say out loud was that some folks were glad for it. Too many men in that town had paid for quiet hands and closed eyes. On the 4th day, he found an ally he hadn't been looking for. Her name was Miss Evangeline Hart, and she ran the schoolhouse on the edge of town, past the fields that used to grow corn, but now only grew dust. She was quiet, sharp-eyed, and too proud to ask for help even when her roof leaked. Folks thought she was a little strange, too well-read, too outspoken, never took a husband. But the children loved her. Hope had once left a wildflower on her desk, and though she'd never said it, Clayton had noticed her watching her from the schoolhouse window sometimes. I know what Grady was, she said simply, when Clayton asked if she'd seen the girl. But no one wanted to hear it. You tried to speak up? She nodded. Twice. Sheriff said it was charity work. Said the children were better off than in the streets. And Hope. I saw her once. After school, she asked me for a book. Didn't speak much, but she looked hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food. Clayton didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. But Evangeline wasn't finished. She opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out a small, worn notebook. I started writing things down. Names, times, people who went in and out of that warehouse. Clayton took the notebook, flipping through it slowly. He recognized names. Some were ranchers. Some were businessmen. One of them was Sheriff Eddings. It didn't shock him, not really. Just made something heavy settle in his chest. Evangeline watched him carefully. You're going after them. I don't have a choice. She nodded once, almost like she'd known all along. Then you'll need help. That was how she became his first real ally. But not the only one. There was also James Harlan, a rancher who lived out past Dry Creek. Younger than Clayton, full of big talk and big plans. He wore a silver ring on his right hand and always carried a pistol like he expected and needed. The two men hadn't spoken much before. Harlan was flashy, loud, and too fast with his words. But Clayton had heard something once about his brother disappearing when they were kids. A story that ended with a grave marked unknown. He found Harlan at the edge of the stockyard, working a deal with a cattle buyer. When Clayton told him about Hope, Harlan went quiet. "You think Grady's part of something bigger?" he asked after a moment. "I know it." Harlan chewed the inside of his cheek, then nodded slowly. "Then we burned the whole thing down." Clayton didn't trust him. Not completely, but he didn't have the luxury of being careful anymore. The problem was, nothing in town was as simple as it seemed. Sheriff Eddings had been sheriff for 20 years. People saw him as a fixture, someone who kept order even if he bent the law to do it. But there was a rumor, buried, whispered, that he'd once been a deputy in a different county before a group of orphans turned up dead outside a train yard. No one could prove anything, and he'd moved town soon after. Now, with Clayton sniffing around, he seemed more nervous than usual. His hand twitched when he reached for his coffee. His eyes darted too fast. He'd started stopping by the ranch unannounced, asking questions about livestock like he actually cared. But it was the banker, Augustus Crane, who made Clayton's stomach turn. Tall, pressed suits, always walking with his head just a bit too high. He'd once offered to buy Clayton's land outright. Said it was a shame to let it rot. Clayton had refused. Crane had smiled thinly and said, "Some debts collect themselves." Now, Clayton started wondering if Grady had ever worked for him. Or worse, if Grady had ever worked him. Because money moved quietly in that town. Quieter than men's mouths. One evening, Evangeline handed Clayton a folded paper. "Hope left this in one of the books she borrowed," she said. It was a rough map, sketched in pencil. A trail leading out beyond the edge of the old quarry, with markings for stops and numbers. A trade route, not for goods, but for children. Clayton's hands shook as he held it. Not because of what it meant, but because Hope had known, had been trying to leave a trail. Still, for every step forward, something pulled back. Harlan was eager. Too eager. He pushed Clayton to confront people in broad daylight, to name names. But when Clayton pressed him, asked why he was so invested, Harlan got cagey. "You don't know what it's like," he said one night, jaw tight. "To lose someone and not get to bury them." Clayton thought he meant his brother, but he wasn't sure. And then there was Evangeline. Steady, smart, but she kept the drawer locked in her schoolhouse. And once, when she thought he wasn't looking, he saw her fold a letter and burn it before it could cool. Secrets. Everyone had them. And while Clayton tried to piece the truth together, he couldn't shake the feeling someone was watching him. Tracks near the barn that weren't his. A broken fence gate that no wind could explain. A boot print under Hope's window. The misdirection started slow. A telegram that never arrived. A man in town who swore he'd seen Hope on a train to Denver, though the depot clerk insisted no such train had left. Someone trying to lead him off the trail or distract him. Then a letter arrived at the ranch. No return address. Inside was a single photograph. Grady, standing beside a train, holding Hope by the arm. The girl's face was turned away, but Clayton knew it was her. Written on the back, in faded pencil, "You can't save her." That was when it all snapped into focus. This wasn't just about Grady, or even about Hope. It was about power, about a system, a hidden world under the dirt of their own town, where people like Hope were moved like cattle, and the men who did it smiled at church on Sundays. The question now wasn't if Clayton could find the girl. It was whether he could do it before the town closed in around him, before the lies became too thick to see through, and before the people he trusted revealed who they really were. The sky over Reeves Ranch began to change in slow, quiet ways. The wind felt different, and the sun hit the fields at a softer angle. The cattle still looked thin, but they had a little more fight in them. Maybe it was the season shifting, or maybe it was something else, something inside Clayton himself that had started to move. Hope's absence hung in every corner of the ranch like a shadow that wouldn't stretch out, but even in her absence, the girl had left something behind, a reason, a fire. Clayton worked longer hours, pushed the horses harder, fixed things he'd let break down long ago, as if mending the land might help him mend the rest. And it wasn't just the land that was changing. Evangeline stopped by more often now. Sometimes she brought books, sometimes apples from a tree behind schoolhouse. She didn't talk much when she visited, just sat on the porch with a straight back and watched the sky the same way Clayton did. He liked that about her. She never asked for conversation, just to fill the silence. One evening, she brought a picture Hope had drawn, just a crooked fence, a barn, and a figure too small to make out, but it mattered. "Found it under the floorboard in the schoolhouse," she said softly. She must have hidden it. Clayton held the paper like it was glass. She thought she'd come back. Evangeline nodded. Kids always hope, even when they shouldn't. There was something unspoken between them that day, sitting on that porch, a kind of thread pulling them together. Not romance, not yet, but recognition of pain, of silence, of shared ghosts. That was the first time Clayton noticed the way her hands trembled slightly when she passed the picture over. He didn't ask why. He learned by now that everyone shook for a reason. Across town, James Harlan was digging too, though his methods were louder. He'd started going into saloons he'd once avoided, playing cards with men who smelled like gunpowder and secrets. Sometimes he returned with names, sometimes with bruises. Clayton didn't always like the way Harlan operated, but he couldn't deny the man got results. One night, Harlan came to the ranch with blood on his knuckles and a name on his tongue. "Bo Hastings," he said, pacing the porch. "Used to run guns across the border. Now he moves kids. Works as a middleman. Says Grady's trying to make a bigger move, one that crosses state lines." Clayton stood, jaw tight. "Why now?" Harlan shrugged. "Money. Or fear. Or maybe someone gave him the go-ahead." They both looked at the sky for a long time. Then Clayton said, "We ride tomorrow." That ride, just the two of them out past the edge of where the roads had names, felt like a return to something old. The trail was dry and twisted, scattered with bones of deer and rusted traps. They found Bo Hastings in a shack leaning sideways against the wind. He had a mouth full of rotten teeth and a gun tucked in his boot. But Harlan got the drop on him before he could move. "You've got one chance," Clayton said, pressing the man against the wall. "Where is she?" Hastings spat blood. "Gone. Grady moves fast." But he gave them a lead, a location on the edge of the county line, an abandoned church used as a way station. Said Hope had been there. Said she was worth more than the others. Neither man liked the sound of that. On the ride back, Harlan grew quiet. At camp that night, under a sky thick with stars, he finally spoke. "My brother," he said, voice rough, "wasn't just taken. He was sold." Clayton didn't respond. "I was supposed to watch him. He was 5. I was 10, but I wanted to go fishing. I left him alone. When I came back, the door was open." He didn't cry, just stared into the fire. "I found his shoe near the tracks. Like he did with Hope." Clayton reached into his coat and handed Harlan a flask. He didn't say anything. Some things didn't need words. By the time they reached the church, the place had already been cleared out. Empty pews, broken glass, ashes still warm in the fireplace. But Hope had been there. Clayton found a torn scrap of her shirt, the same one she'd worn when they'd fixed the fence line. He held the cloth for a long time, staring at it like it could speak. That night, he dreamed of fire, his old house burning, his wife screaming, Hope running toward the flames. When he woke, sweat poured down his back, and his heart pounded like hooves on dry earth. He didn't tell Harlan about the dream, but he did tell Evangeline. And when he did, something cracked in her. "I had a sister," she said quietly, 15 years old. She used to write poems about getting out of this place. Thought she'd be a teacher in the city. One day, she went to town and never came back. Clayton looked at her and realized she wasn't just helping because she was kind. She was helping because she, too, was still searching for someone she'd never find. "You think she ended up in Grady's hands?" he asked. "I think no one cared enough to stop it," she said. That was when the three of them, Clayton, Harlan, and Evangeline, stopped acting like separate people chasing different ghosts. They became something else. A team, a fire, a crack in the town's silence. And slowly, The crack spread. People started whispering. A woman at the feed store told Evangeline she remembered seeing Hope get pulled into a wagon. A young man who'd worked freight confessed that crates marked as tools sometimes held other things. Fear still ruled, but the dam was breaking. Even Sheriff Eddings started losing control. He stopped by the ranch again, this time not to chat, but to warn. You keep digging, you're going to find things you won't like. Clayton didn't answer him, just stared until Eddings left. But the warning stuck with him. One night, he found a box on his porch. Inside was a rope, coiled, clean, no note, just a message. He burned it in silence. The next morning, Evangeline came by, eyes wide with worry. There's talk of a wagon heading north tonight. Grady might be moving the last of the kids. Clayton felt his pulse quicken. Where? Old Fort Ridge. The supply trail. They didn't wait. Harlan met them halfway with rifles and a pack horse. The three rode through dusk, through shadows thick as oil. No words passed between them. Just breath. Just the weight of what waited. At the ridge, they waited in the brush. And then they saw it. A wagon. Covered, slow moving. Two men on the front bench, one riding behind. Clayton's chest seized when he saw the small hand press against the canvas from inside. Hope. He didn't wait for a signal. He stepped out of the trees and raised his rifle. Stopped the wagon. The riders froze. Then the one in back went for his gun. A shot rang out. Harlan's. Clean. The man dropped. Clayton approached the wagon as the other two held up their hands. Inside, he found 3 children. One was Hope. Pale, shaking, but alive. She climbed out slowly, eyes wide, chest heaving. Clayton reached out. Hope didn't speak, just grabbed his hand and didn't let go. They didn't go back to town that night. They rode to an old hunting cabin near the ridge and lit a fire. Clayton held Hope close while Evangeline checked the other children for wounds. Harlan stood guard. When Hope finally spoke, it was a whisper. I thought you forgot. Clayton's voice cracked. Never. In that cabin, the walls finally broke. Hope cried. So did Evangeline. And Clayton, so long turned to stone, let the tears fall too. They hadn't won. Not really. The town would still whisper. Men would still hide behind power. And not every child taken would come back. But for that night, under those stars, they had taken something back. A name. A life. A piece of hope. The night after rescuing Hope, it rained hard. The kind of rain that soaks deep and stirs up things buried long ago. Clayton lay awake, listening to the roof drip above his bed. Hope had fallen asleep against his side, but even in sleep, the girl twitched and murmured, chased by whatever Grady's men had done in that wagon. Clayton brushed a hand through the girl's hair, heart clenched. It was a strange kind of joy, having her home, but it came wrapped in dread. This wasn't over, not even close. The next morning brought trouble, as it often does in places where silence has ruled for too long. Someone set fire to the old schoolhouse. Evangeline got there before it collapsed, but not before smoke blackened the chalkboard and every book inside. She stood in front of the ruins, her dress wet, her hands blistered. Her face was a mask, anger barely held back by duty. Clayton rode up just as the final beam fell. They're sending a message, she said. Clayton didn't have to ask who they were. By nightfall, news had spread that the sheriff's office was empty. Eddings gone without a trace. Some said he'd left town under cover of dark. Others whispered Grady had silenced him. Either way, the town felt thinner without him, like a wall had been knocked down. But instead of relief, it let the rot show. More people began to turn their eyes away, not out of ignorance anymore, but fear. Clayton stopped by the general store and saw a man pull his daughter inside, just at the sight of him. Harlan reported that Crane had been seen packing up the last of his papers at the bank, preparing to disappear. They were closing in on something, and the men behind this network of stolen children knew it. But Clayton wasn't ready for what came next. It was Hope. 3 days after the rescue, she stopped speaking. Not entirely, not like she forgot how, but like she didn't want it anymore. She barely ate, barely moved. Sat on the porch for hours staring at the yard like it might disappear if she blinked. Clayton tried everything. Rides out to the ridge, old cowboy stories, even building a birdhouse. Nothing worked. One night, after Hope refused dinner again, Clayton finally snapped. "You're here. You're home. You're safe. Why won't you talk to me?" Hope didn't cry. She didn't even look at him. Just stood and walked outside. Evangeline found her in the barn later, curled up beside the dog, sound asleep. "You're scaring her," she told Clayton quietly. "Even if you don't mean to." "She's scaring me," Clayton admitted. "I can't fix this." "You can't fix everything," she said. "You just have to stay." That hit something in him. The old wound. Because staying had never been his strong suit. After Mary died, he'd left everything. The ranch, the land, the future. He'd lived like a ghost for years, drifting from job to job, bottle to bottle. It had taken everything in him to come back. To try again. To raise Hope like a father should. And now the one thing he wanted, to see the girl smile, to hear her laugh again, was slipping further away. At the same time, Harlan was unraveling in his own way. His search for Grady had turned obsessive. He started skipping sleep, riding out to abandoned mines and cabins on rumors alone. Evangeline confronted him after he came back with a cracked rib and no answers. "You're not helping her like this," she said. "I'm not helping anyone if I let Grady vanish," he growled. She stepped in front of him. "You think if you catch him, the guilt will go away? That bringing him in will erase what happened to your brother?" That stopped him cold. He looked at her like a man waking from a long fever. "No," he said, "but it's the only thing that'll let me breathe again." Meanwhile, threats were turning to action. Someone poisoned the cattle trough at the ranch. Dozens of animals dead in one night. Clayton found the message scrawled in ash on the barn door. "Take one more. We take yours." Hope saw it too, and for the first time in days, she spoke. "They want me back." Clayton dropped to one knee. "They won't get you." Hope's eyes, too old for her years, met his. "You can't promise that." And she was right, because every time Clayton thought they were getting close to an end, it shifted, moved further away. It wasn't just one man. Grady was a symptom. The rot went deeper. This was a web, connected through money, power, silence. And someone in town was still feeding it. That's when Evangeline brought them something unexpected. A map. It had been drawn by a student, handed to her weeks ago before the fire. "Just a game," he'd said. "A pretend treasure hunt." But when she looked again, she saw the pattern. X's at key points. All near old mail routes. All places they'd found evidence. Tracks, crates, burned camps. The boy hadn't known what he was drawing, but he'd been watching. The biggest X was marked at the edge of Dry Creek Gorge, a place no one visited, abandoned decades ago after a mine collapsed. Evangeline laid the map on the table between them. "I think it's their stronghold." Harlan was already packing bullets. But Clayton hesitated. Hope still wasn't eating, wasn't sleeping. And Clayton couldn't leave her again, not this time. "I'll stay," Evangeline said softly. "She trusts me. Go. Finish this." So Clayton rode out with Harlan one last time. The trail to Dry Creek Gorge was quiet. Too quiet. When they reached the canyon edge, the sun was dipping behind a ridge. They moved slow, rifles ready. Found the entrance to the mine blocked by rusted metal. But inside, they found signs. Bedding. Crates. Tools. And a ledger. Another one. Names again, but this time with photographs. Children's faces. Ages. Selling prices. Clayton stared at the open book, ball rising in his throat. Then the shot rang out. Harlan dropped. Clayton dug beside him, found blood blooming from his shoulder. Not fatal, but deep. Grady stepped out from behind the rock, rifle in hand, grin stretched across his filthy face. "I knew you'd come," he said. "You always were a bleeding heart fool." Clayton stood, rage pulsing. "You're finished." Grady laughed. "I was finished the day men like you stopped looking away. But it doesn't matter. You think this dies with me? You think I'm the only one?" He raised his rifle. Clayton fired first. Grady dropped without a word. Clayton stood there for a long moment, chest heaving. Then he went to Harlan, helped him up. "You okay?" Harlan winced. Tired of being shot. They burned the ledgers right there. Not because they didn't want justice, but because they knew justice wouldn't come through courts. Not out here. The real justice would be in making sure none of it happened again. Back at the ranch, Hope met them at the gate. When Clayton dismounted, the girl walked straight into his arms. "You came back," Hope whispered. "Always," Clayton said, voice breaking. Evangeline stood on the porch, arms crossed, face unreadable. Clayton looked at her, then back at Hope. "We're staying," he said. "All of us." The war wasn't over, but the fight, at least, had been won. And in that hard, stubborn land, under a wide sky that held both sorrow and hope, they finally began to heal. The ride back into town was slow and heavy with silence. Hope sat in front of Clayton on the saddle, her small back pressed tightly against the man's chest. She didn't speak much, just held onto the saddle horn and stared ahead like someone who'd seen more than a child ever should. Clayton didn't press her. Some silences needed space. What mattered was that she was alive, flesh and blood, not just a memory or a ghost on the wind. That was enough for now. They reached Reeves' ranch by dawn. Evangeline and Harlan rode alongside, worn and quiet, each carrying their own exhaustion. The children they'd rescued had been sent to safe homes along the way, places Evangeline trusted. But Hope had insisted on going home. When Clayton lifted her down from the saddle, the girl didn't go inside. She just stood there in the yard, staring at the barn, the broken fence, the line of trees along the backfield. Then she turned to Clayton and said, "It still feels like he's watching." Clayton's throat tightened. He crouched beside her, laying a hand on her shoulder. "He's not. Not anymore." But even as he said it, Clayton wasn't sure it was true, because there were still names unspoken, deeds left in the dark. Sheriff Eddings had vanished 2 days before they left for the ridge. Crane, the banker, had shuttered his office with a note on the door about urgent business back east. And Grady? Grady was still out there. Harlan's bullet had taken down one of his men, but not him. He'd slipped away like a rat through the brush. Clayton knew the work wasn't finished. Not until the men who fed off the backs of children were exposed for what they were. Not until the truth burned through the town like wildfire. That truth came knocking sooner than he thought. It started with a letter. Evangeline brought it to him. No return address, just his name in tight handwriting on the front. Inside, a single line. "You want to rest? Come to where it ended, where you buried her." Clayton sat down hard on the porch steps, heart slamming in his chest. He hadn't spoken of her in years. His wife, Mary. She died 10 years ago, giving birth to their stillborn daughter. Clayton had buried her beneath the cottonwood tree behind the barn. He hadn't visited the grave in months, maybe years. Couldn't bear to. Evangeline sat beside him. "What does it mean?" He didn't answer right away. Just stood, walked out behind the barn, and stopped in front of the cottonwood. The grave was undisturbed, but next to it, a fresh set of tracks. A boot print. Deep, recent. Someone had been here. Someone who knew. Clayton sank to his knees, touched the dry earth with his fingers. "She wanted a girl," he whispered. Said she dreamed of teaching her how to braid her hair. Said it was the one thing she never learned herself. Evangeline knelt beside him. "She'd be proud of you." He shook his head. "She'd be horrified. I let the world get this bad and did nothing." "No," Evangeline said gently. "You're fighting now, and you're not doing it alone." Clayton looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw it. The grief behind her eyes, the steel underneath it, the way she carried the weight of every child she couldn't save, every word gone unheard. He reached out and took her hand. "I need to finish this," he said, "before it rots everything that's left." And so he did what he hadn't done in years. He went back into town, not hiding, not quiet. He walked straight down Main Street, Hope beside him, Harlan and Evangeline following behind. He stopped outside the sheriff's office and knocked once. No answer. Inside, the place was empty. The desk was cleared, the safe left open, but there was a single envelope taped to the inside of the drawer. Clayton opened it. Inside was a ledger. Names, payments, routes, Grady's handwriting, and more than that, Crane's signature. Not once, dozens of times. Authorizing transport, authorizing payment, proof. Clayton walked straight from the office to the church, where townsfolk gathered every Sunday to sing and pretend their town wasn't soaked in silence and fear. He climbed the steps, burst through the doors mid-sermon. The preacher stopped. So did everyone else. Clayton held the ledger high. "You all know me," he said. "You know I don't talk unless I got something worth saying. So hear me now. Your sheriff, your banker, and a dozen men in this town have been selling children like they were livestock. And I got the names." Gasps. Murmurs. Someone stood. Another sat down fast. Clayton opened the ledger and started reading. Page by page. Name by name. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. By the time he finished, the room had turned cold. One man, a merchant with thick hands and a red face, stood and made for the door. Harlan blocked it. "No one leaves," he said. "Not till the marshal arrives." Evangeline stepped forward with a stack of copies. "We're mailing these to every town from here to Kansas City. Every paper, every church, every school." The confrontation lasted only 10 minutes, but it broke something wide open. Later that night, back at the ranch, Hope came to Clayton's room. She didn't speak, just crawled into bed beside him and clung to his arm. Clayton held her tight and stared at the ceiling, heart pounding, grief and rage still spinning inside him. "I thought you left because you didn't want me anymore," Hope said quietly. Clayton swallowed hard. "No, daughter. I left because I couldn't protect you, and it tore me apart." Hope looked up at him. "But you came back." "Yes," Clayton whispered. "I came back." That was the breakthrough. Not the speech in the church, not the ledger, but that quiet moment between a girl and the man who refused to lose her. In the days that followed, arrests were made. A marshal rode in from the capital. Papers ran the story. Other towns began speaking up, emboldened by the light finally cast on the dark. Grady was still out there, yes, but now the world was watching. One evening, Hope stood at the fence line, staring out at the setting sun. Clayton joined her. "You ever think he'll come back?" the girl asked. "Grady?" Hope nodded. Clayton rested a hand on her shoulder. "If he does, we'll be ready." Hope nodded and leaned into him. "I'm not scared anymore." Neither was Clayton, because the worst had already happened. And still they stood, together. Spring came late that year, as if the land itself had needed time to thaw from everything it had held. But when it did, it came in full. The fields turned green again, dotted with tiny wildflowers that Hope picked one by one and lined along the porch rail. The air smelled of new grass and the dust of things long buried. For the first time in years, Reeves Ranch didn't feel like a place marked by ghosts. It felt like a place you could come home to. Clayton worked the fields with Hope by his side. They didn't talk much about what happened out at Dry Creek Gorge. The girl knew enough. But sometimes at the edge of chore, Hope would ask things like, "Do you think the other kids are okay?" Or "Why do bad men want money more than people?" And Clayton would answer as best he could. Simple, honest, without pretending to have it all figured out. Because Hope didn't need lies. She needed truth she could grow from. One evening, after fencing the north pasture, Hope brought him a hammer and pointed to the tree out back, the cottonwood where Mary was buried. "Can we build something here?" she asked. Clayton looked down at her, surprised. "Like what?" "A bench, so you don't have to stand every time you come talk to her." It hit Clayton like a shot to the heart. He nodded once, throat tight, and they built it together. Simple pine wood, strong legs, no carving. But they set it right under the shade, and when they were done, Hope sat down and said, "Hi, Miss Mary. I'm Hope. I'm her girl now, if that's okay." Clayton couldn't speak. He just sat beside her, hand resting on the bench like it might hold him upright. That was the first symbolic act. The second came weeks later when the town finally voted to rebuild the schoolhouse. Not a patch job, a real school, with windows and a bell and desks carved by hand. Evangeline stood at the center of it all, organizing volunteers, accepting donations, drawing up plans. But when the foundation was poured, she asked Clayton and Hope to lay the first stone. "You two are why we get to build again," she said. "You're the start." Clayton wasn't used to being called something good, but he took the stone, pressed it into place, and let Hope pat the wet mortar with her palm. The imprint stayed. Harlan healed slower. His shoulders stiffened in the cold, and his temper flared when he overdid it. But he stayed on at the ranch, sleeping in the bunkhouse, helping when he could. Sometimes he'd disappear for a day or two, riding out to places no one asked about. Clayton knew he still chased ghosts, still needed to prove something to himself. But he always came back, and that was enough. One night, after supper, the three of them sat on the porch. Hope was asleep in Clayton's lap, and Evangeline leaned against the railing, watching the stars. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. "Used to," Clayton said. "Not anymore." She nodded slowly. "Me neither." Then, after a pause, she said, "She's not broken, you know. She bends, but she doesn't break." "I see that now," Clayton whispered. "And you?" she asked, quiet. Clayton looked at her then, really looked. She was tired, yes, weathered by grief and work and years of carrying other people's pain. But there was light in her still, a fire that hadn't gone out. "I'm learning," he said, "learning how to stay." That was the third act. The final one came in the form of a letter. Not from the town, not from the courts, but from one of the children they'd rescued, written in a shaky, careful hand. It was short. "I'm safe now, in a place with trees. They let us grow our own food. Sometimes I still wake up scared, but I think about your face, Mr. Reeves, and I feel better. Thank you for coming back for us." Clayton read it twice, then folded it and tucked it in the pocket over his heart. By summer, the schoolhouse had a roof. Hope started reading out loud again. Harlan planted a row of peach trees by the barn. And Evangeline, she stayed. They didn't need to speak vows or declare anything grand. But on Sundays, when the wind was soft and the world felt possible again, Clayton would find her hand in his. No ceremony, no audience, just the quiet promise of two people who'd seen the worst and still chose to stay. The past never left completely. Shadows lingered in certain corners, but they no longer ruled the house. The ranch was filled now with sound, hammering, laughter, the low hum of life starting over. And on the bench beneath the cottonwood, three names would one day be carved. Mary, Hope, Clayton, family. Not by blood, but by choice. That was the closure they'd earned. Not perfect, but real, and deeply, stubbornly, beautifully human.